pentagram dedicated to Henry Foreman. In the years of the primal force,
It is pronounced Samhain, by the way. Not Samhain. Never Samhain. Samhain is the Irish word for October. So, Samhain sounds much cooler than Sam Hain, doesn't it? Sounds like a 70s serial killer or something. So it's Samhain, my friends. This is Agitators Anonymous, and this is the last episode of the month, and the month is called, repeat after me, Samhain. Right, let's get into it. I'm going to talk about, well, as a kind of riposte, so to say, to my podcast of a couple of weeks ago, which got a lot of reaction. I listened to 50 bands because I'm a masochist, or so you don't have to, was kind of the implication of that podcast. Of course, it was tongue-in-cheek and done in one of those stupid ways that gets sharing and tongues wagging and all that kind of thing. What was that terrible website? 13 things I learned about this, or whatever it was. People love a list, don't they? People love a good old Schindler's List. Right then, so I'm going to discuss that, and I'm going to discuss the idea that maybe I was incorrect, and one album that's come out to buck the trend, and also to really examine the idea that the golden age of heavy metal is sort of gone. Something which I've been sort of standing behind as an idea over the last while. So I'm going to examine that. Let's get into it. Agitators Anonymous. This one is going to be a heavy metal episode. So if you're looking for crushing political and cultural analysis, this episode may not be for you. But if you're an aging thrasher who's a bit disgruntled at the state of the modern metal scene, well, stay tuned. So before we get into the episode, as ever, the podcast is sponsored by Metal Blade Records, the home of Primordial. So you can go to www.metalblade.indiemerch.com, INDIE, metalblade.indiemerch.com, and you can use the code AA2024, and then you type 10% off, and you can get 10% off your order. It is the home of Show No Mercy, Hell Awaits, Cannibal Corpse, Fate's Warning, Merciful Fate, Primordial, tons and tons of bands, Sirith Ungol. The list is endless. Times are tough, and that 10% off can mean an awful lot. And this is the only metal label that is still independent. Right then. Now, back to the episode. You can follow me on Nemthianga_Primordial and Primordial_official if you want to see more of my inane and not very constructive, which is also part of the problem and some of the things I'm going to get into when discussing what is missing from the modern metal scene. Perhaps it is exactly that. It is the idea that content and the creation of content overshadows the creation of music. Well, let's get into it. So first things first, an album has come out this year that I've listened to, I imagine, maybe 15 times so far in the last week, which is, if you know me, quite incredible actually. It's not normal for me to become that kind of obsessed with a record. I think the last record I really obsessed about like that was the David Eugene Edwards record, Hyacinth. But the new Coroner album, Dissonance Theory, has just been playing over and over again. And it kind of got me reflecting on the I listened to 50 new bands so you didn't have to thread, because it encapsulates virtually everything that every single band in that thread was missing. And it got me thinking, why? Is this really to do with Coroner? Is it to do with me and my relationship to the new and the old metal scene? Or what is it that Coroner have understood that seems severely lacking in so much of the modern metal scene? To me, already, it's album of the year. Well, already, hey, it's Samhain, as I said. It is October, so there's only really 2 months left. But it is, so far, head and shoulders the album of the year. It's a long time since I had to worry about Head and Shoulders. I know you're here for the dad jokes. So why have Coroner been able to do this? The first things first, I used to be a member of the Death Cult Lodge, the Coroner fan club. And I do remember getting a package from the Death Cult Lodge. I mean, it's a rather ominous sounding fan club name, isn't it? From Switzerland, strangely enough, who've become the Centre for Assisted Dying. And I do remember a family member picking up the package when it arrived in 1990, perhaps, which is the seminal, the No More Colour year, which is such an incredible record, No More Colour. I digress, but it's that kind of thrash that you just don't hear anymore. Coroner, even though in 1990 they were probably younger than all the pizza thrash and all the kind of thrash bands I talk about now that I don't really resonate with, they were younger then but seemed already 2-3 times as old as that kind of thrash because it was dark. It was dark, and I'm going to get into that. The Death Cult Lodge, I was member 300 or 230 or 40 or something like this, and someone thought that I'd bought a suicide pack in my teenage years sent to me from Switzerland from the Death Cult Lodge. I can forgive that misunderstanding. But is it that absence has made the heart grow fonder, as they say? Because Coroner have been missing since the album Grin, which is maybe 95 or so, when they became, I think, a little bit too obsessed with this sort of rhythmic Young Gods style sound. And I'm going to be using Coroner as a sort of analogy for what this whole conversation really embodies. Because it could just be that I'm an old fan and it feels like reconnecting with an old flame. It feels like putting back on those old pair of runners you had when you were 20 years old and going, God, I think I run faster in these. They were a band who were far, far ahead of their time back in the day. They seemed, as I said, older in 1990 than many bands who are twice their age now. And metal was, and this is the thing when I was talking about those 50 new bands that I listened to, the problem is they're all competing with the idea that back then things were virgin territory. 1990 is 35 years ago. And that may sound really strange to anybody who is of the same vintage who remembers Coroner in their heyday. But that is 35 years ago. 1970 was only 20 years away from 1990. Kill 'Em All was only 7 years from 1990. And I remember picking up Coroner albums in 88 and 89 and 90. And already by 89, you felt like 83 was just a distant memory. But that was only a couple of years previous. Coroner seemed born old. There was something about their aesthetic that really resonated, along with Holy Terror and Voivod, a kind of dark take on thrash metal that is almost, you hardly ever see or hear that kind of thing. Maybe it's impossible. Maybe it's impossible to do because on some level maybe some of their aesthetics were more similar to black metal. And what is it really that has the Coroner stand out? Of course, as an older thrash metal fan, the first thing I hear when I hear it is I'm not sure that I really love the guitar production. I always want something different left to right. 2 different inputs, 2 different sounds. The bass, yeah, I like it. Very good drum sound, but very modern. But then again, Coroner sounded modern in 1990. No More Colour or Mental Vortex were quite progressive in their idea for 1990 or 1991 albums. So is it unusual that they sound modern? But what it is the depth of songwriting, and that's what I was sort of trying to get at there in the first couple of minutes. Does the depth of this songwriting really come with age? Could a young band make songs with such dark complexity and indeed theoretical dissonance? That's the question. Now, we could say that it is entirely possible, of course, because Coroner already did it in their youth. You listen to Masked Jackal or listen to songs from Punishment for Decadence or No More Colour. They are wise and old and mature, almost beyond their years. So it's not impossible. But what is the disconnect? How is it impossible now that bands don't seem to be able to reach into the same songwriting maturity, even at a young age? Part of me thinks that because bands now are, I suppose, obsessed, or at least they are consumed by the creation of content. Is that almost as important to them as the writing of the songs. A good example is the band Castle Rat, who are getting pretty popular now. And okay, it's like high camp, and they have all their outfits and they have their aesthetic very well delivered. But I first came across one of their videos, and it just seemed like a couple of years ago, and I said to some friends of mine in labels in Europe, you should watch this band, maybe even try and sign them. I think they're going to blow up. My instinct was that they just managed to capture the aesthetic correctly. And you look at the singer, I don't know what her name is, and her aesthetic, she has her own Instagram following where she just looks like a kind of 70s model, an extra from Taxi Driver or something. Is this just high New York? Is this just what always happened? Or did a band like that sit and just work out the entire aesthetic and the entire thing? Now, of course, Castle Rat, not a bad band. But is this what it is? Is that younger bands are not sitting around concentrating on the songwriting or concentrating on the relationship to... And this is one of the things I've noticed about mainstream music, including rock music and including metal, is that the world seems so much darker. I mean, well, is it really though? If you think about it, Coroner's moment was filled with Cold War paranoia. The entire 1980s, and I remember being shown movies as a kid about what happens when, when the bombs start falling and, the hide under the bathtub, hide under your school table, all that kind of thing. We were shown cartoons about nuclear war and all this kind of stuff. And there was this incredible Cold War paranoia that formed a lot of the anger of thrash metal. You can see it in Terrible Certainty by Creator. You can see it in that whole Ruhr Valley sort of German thrash metal. Not the escapist satanic kind of stuff or the leather studs satanic speed metal stuff, but it was in Voivod. And then you have the fall of the Berlin Wall and so many other things happening. Is the world darker now than it was then, or are we just constantly informed about it? So an awful lot of modern metal seems to be a kind of, in my view, a juvenile reaction in a way to where the world is. As I said before, the sort of broader emasculation of society, I think, has partly meant that there is no angry men with guitars in the mainstream of music. The mainstream of music seems to be highly feminized to me, about singular pop starlets, including some men as well. But part of that, of course, is because you can't market a band anymore. It just has to be a face, a person. But there's something missing from it. And there's also something missing from elements of metal as well. And that is, again, something dark. So how were Coroner able to just pick up exactly where they left off and pick up this dark thread and run straight away with it? Because they've already displayed that you can have mature, dark songwriting as a young person. So, of course, if there was any band I was going to trust to pick up the baton right away from all those years ago and run with it, it is, of course, a band like Coroner, who seem to have understood the aesthetic even from day one, if you look back on the pictures from the Death Cult demo, or R.I.P., for example. So what could we say? Could we say these days the metal scene is in a terrible rush to get somewhere very quickly? Because, of course, there are so many bands trying to eke out that small piece of the pie. Do you eke out pie? I don't think so, really. That's the wrong analogy. But the fight for content, the fight for your space of the scene seems to be so profound that maybe that's what it is, that the songwriting craft can get lost in that rush to get to the end line. Because if you don't, you can do all you want. But if you don't play the game, I mean, of course, some bands aren't required to play the game, but friends of mine from the band Todo Mal, which if you speak Spanish is a really isn't the greatest name in the world, but a very good band, Todomal, if you want to go and check it out. They are making a new album, and there are some old friends of mine involved in that, and we've been having discussions back and forth about how do the old men grapple with this new world, because their music could appeal to a lot of people, I think, but unless they grapple with creating the content and the reels and getting all the other stuff out there, less people will hear about it. Less people will gravitate towards them. Less people will sadly hear the music. The music unfortunately can't stand on its own anymore. And it made me think, would this Coroner album, I think I would have liked it anyway, even if it wasn't Coroner. If it was a new band, I would have recognised, oh, holy fuck, this new band, they have their fucking shit together. But is it because it's Coroner? It's because they were able to lean on that structure they already created from the past. Now, of course, there are so many clever songwriting reveals within the new Coroner album that on repeated listens, you hear to yourself, oh, I'd listen to that clever thing that they've done there. And the vocals, which have always been quite a sort of stern, straight thing within Coroner, there's also touches which add a chorus. There's some interesting, very, very interesting songwriting flourishes. The drumming, of course, is amazing. But it got me thinking, am I thinking this because it has the logo Coroner on it that I'm so familiar with, that I so loved once upon a time? So maybe for somebody who is really into modern thrash, how do they see it? And that the world was dark back then, and maybe sitting in it from neutral Switzerland was a good place to sit on the fence and observe this Cold War paranoia from I wouldn't say a distance, because if the bombs were going to fall, hey, you're going to get it whether you're in the Alps or not. Are you listening to me, Davos, huh? So is it partly as an older listener, as someone who quite openly on the podcast has said that I felt a bit distanced and detached from some of the tropes of modern metal, all of a sudden something rides out of the gloom from our past and it goes, hey, you remember this? Remember this? And you're able to reconnect with those things because you have a kind of memory of it from the past. Or is it genuinely as good as you think it is? Or do you trust your instinct as a motherfucker who was there back in the day to realise, yes, I do think this is as good as it is. It also got me returning to a band called Watchtower, which was about the most deeply unsexy band you can imagine. But Watchtower had an album called Control and Resistance about the Cold War. And it's a very complicated, dense prog record. Coroner is on the way to Watchtower, but it's much more easy to digest. And this was a record that I loved when I was 14 or 15, 16. It's really strange that I would love it. How were my tastes that culture to be able to be interested in something so complex and dark and, to be honest, frustrating sometimes to listen to? And also the subject matter seemed to be this post Day of the Jackal sort of spy intrigue involved in the lyric writing. I think their first album was called Energetic Disassembly, and it really got me into this 87 to 90 kind of Cold War thrash intrigue. How are those bands able to create this dark stuff that I think, could it be almost impossible now? You can answer me in the comments if you think you have an equivalent. But if you take Coroner's big hit, Masked Jackal, and read the lyrics, and then you apply them to a Trump or a Macron, or hey, pick your politician, and they will seem as prescient as ever. They seem to speak more, almost in a way, to the present day than back then. Or perhaps then that's the nature of the timeless creation of something that artistically can speak to any moment in history. Yeah, I get it. Come on now, don't get too overblown with this Coroner love-in. I understand. And the truth is, maybe I just love it because it's the first return, and maybe it's the same thing as when Destruction came back. I thought, oh cool, Destruction is back, and I saw them at Wacken, and I never thought I'd see Destruction playing Infernal Overkill and that kind of thing. And now 4, 5, 6 albums back into the Destruction return. If you asked me, have I really paid attention to the last couple, I would say, strangely enough, this band has passed on to become something that resonates with a younger audience. I've kind of left the building when it's come to Destruction. Where maybe I'll feel the same way about Coroner if they keep making records. Also, one thing that I've been thinking about pretty much is that, and this is the paradox, if we consider that the golden era of this kind of music, let's say this kind of thrash metal was 1986 to 1991 or 1985 to 1990, isn't it odd that these bands somehow seem bigger than ever? Not in terms of their creativity, or not in terms of their what we consider to be their golden age, when all the classic albums came out. But if Coroner toured Europe in 1990 or 1991 as a headliner, you're talking about 150 to 250 people. They weren't pulling 800 people. If you talk about Morbid Angel, I saw Morbid Angel and Unleashed back in 1991. That was 400 people there, maybe 500. Blood Incantation are right now pulling 800 up to 1,000 people. These old classic bands are arguably playing to more people than ever. I mean, Coroner will probably play the festival circuit next summer and play possibly to more people than they've ever played with in their entire career, or played to in their entire career. Isn't that a strange paradox? That we're constantly told, here's such and such a band playing their classic album from 30 or 40 years ago, and you realise that 30 or 40 years ago, the touring and festival circuit that exists now didn't exist. It's become a classic album because of our collective relationship to this heavy metal iconic memory. But arguably, are Coroner bigger than ever? You have a look on Spotify, they've got 160,000 monthly listeners. I don't imagine they had that in 1990, although they did probably have 40,000 people who bought Mental Vortex and who have physical copies of it. Again, I return to the "you shall own nothing and be happy" model, which, as I read out in a podcast a week or two ago, it's a strange thing to realize that all you own is passwords, is it not, my friends? So that's why you should, of course, go out and buy this Coroner album. But you see what I mean. So sometimes I think I'm in danger of saying, oh, the glory days are over. The glory days are over. I mean, Primordial, as a slightly different example, played to more people at festivals this last summer than probably any other year in our existence. But yet there are people who will say to you, their glory days, 1998 or 2000. I mean, in the year 1998 or 1999, we were playing a couple of shows in Europe a year, maybe a club show to 80 or 100 people here and there with Hades and Eternus and Tirfing. Of course, it was amazing, but it was what it was. And now there is greater opportunity, although we're constantly told that, and I would count myself within the argument. Every now and again they give me the loud hailer and I shout about it on Agitators Anonymous here with you guys. And it's a strange paradox. It's something I've been dwelling on all week. Is the festival circuit of 2026 going to be Coroner's victory lap? After all these years of, they probably quit in 1995 because they thought they were not going anywhere. They'd reached a sort of impasse with Grin, which was only 8 years into their recording career, if it's not 1996, because RIP is 1987. So in those 8 years, and don't forget, your generous and convivial host right here has a musical career of 35 years, of 30 plus years, with 10 albums. That Coroner maybe felt, I guess, like many thrash bands in the early 90s, that death metal had sort of bitch slapped them into the periphery. And back then, the stakes were higher. There was a lot more money put into recording, into budgets, into everything. And maybe you felt like, hey, what the fuck are we doing? We should have progressed beyond sitting in the back of a van playing to 143 people in, some provincial Swiss town with Messiah in support. Actually, it sounds like a pretty good lineup when I say it like that. Messiah also have a new album out, by the way. If you don't know the Swiss band Messiah, maybe go and check out their Extreme Cold Weather, which has one of the stupidest covers ever, a polar bear on it. Come on, guys, you could have thought of something else. Anyway, the point being, perhaps the festival circuit of 2026, my dear Freud, of 2026, is their victory lap. Perhaps that's what the bloated, huge festival season, which seems to have more and more additions every year. This is many bands' victory lap because they're playing to more people than ever before. Blood Incantation will be playing on a festival stage next year and there could be 25,000 people watching. This was unthinkable in 1990 or 1991, with the exception of a Donington to just see Slayer. You were not seeing extreme metal bands to play in front of tens of thousands of people. And arguably, Morbid Angel, I guess Covenant is the biggest selling Morbid Angel album. Maybe it's 300,000, I suppose. Bands now are lucky physically to do even just a couple of thousand copies. Now I'm sure Blood and Incantation are doing a pretty good chunk of vinyl, maybe 7 or 8 or 9, maybe 10,000 copies on vinyl. I don't know. My feeling is the vinyl boom has kind of ended a bit. At least speaking to everybody I know who's running stalls at festivals and shows, they've kind of said that, yeah, post-lockdown, the cost of everything, of course, you could get a vinyl for 16, 18, 22 euro before lockdown. Now sometimes they're 35 to 40. And also the shipping and the packaging and all this kind of, all the other boring stuff. But also it strikes me that the younger generation of metal fans, compared to the underground cult with a K and an U with an umlaut, are not as obsessed with vinyl as the underground people from 10, 12, 14 or 15 years ago. And so, are we saying that the creative golden age was in the past? More or less. The physical sales were in the past, more or less. Streaming, of course, is a different thing. It's hard to quantify in those terms. But that the live circuit, the festival circuit, if you break into that, you have a chance of playing to more people than was ever dreamt of by an underground band in 1991. I mean, there are bands who, realistically, in 1991 would not really have even got a gig. Probably they might have got a gig in the youth hall in the next town over or the next county over. If you're from Ireland, you know what I mean. It's all about the county. Or maybe you were from Belgium and you swapped some shows with somebody in Holland, or, you Ancient Rites to Deadhead, to Pestilence, back to Inquisitor, or whatever. You weren't able to just go, hey, you know what, we're going to be third on the main stage and play in front of 10,000 people. It just was kind of unthinkable. And it's something that we've all really begun to take for granted, I think, in the metal scene, that didn't exist in the old days. And maybe that's part of the understanding of the key to the lock, or the understanding to all of this. Maybe back then, because the scene was much more local, you didn't have a sort of global vision of it. It wasn't about trying to make content to break through for a sort of global potential audience. You were concentrated on your own music, your own scene, and you took it step by step gradually. And you were able to mature your songwriting chops, as they say, in accordance with that kind of thing. You learned a little bit incrementally, as opposed to maybe there are bands, well, certainly not a maybe, but certainly a definitely, who sit down and they plan it all and they go, okay, so you're going to do this, you're going to do that, the other. And there are people who've grown up with smartphones in their hands, who grow up with social media, who just know what to do. They know what gets clicks, they know what generates this, they just know what to do. And have they sat down in a room and gone, right then, here's how we create our global audience, here's how we create the buzz about ourselves, here's what we use to our advantage, here's the aesthetic, here are the hoods we wear, here are the costumes we make, this is the kind of videos we're going to make, blah, 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 blah. And then maybe after that, they sit down with a guitar and go, does anyone have any riffs? I have one, I think it'll do. I don't know. Maybe I'm being grumpy old man shouts at clouds. Well, grumpy old man might indeed shout at clouds, but for the last week, he's been very much enjoying the new Coroner album, and it just got me thinking about how it's an example, an exemplar of songwriting maturity and thinking about those structures, which somehow seems to be missing from so many things these days. Speaking of which, my bass is sitting here looking at me going, you may be saying that, but you're not doing that when it comes to learning your bass lines for the new Dread Sovereign album, which is in production. Do as I say, not as I do, my friends. Agitators Anonymous, what do you think? What do you think about my premise about all of this? Perhaps the festival circuit is really just the bloated carcass of heavy metal floating around on a cruise ship. Who knows? Perhaps it is the massively obese Henry VIII wobbling around his estate, pained with gout, balancing his crown on his bulging forehead, dressed and festooned in ridiculous pantaloons before he keels over from a heart attack and dies. And they carry him off on a cart and dump him in a shallow grave. Perhaps it's that, but for now I'll just enjoy the new Coroner album. This is Agitators Anonymous. I am Alan Averill. I thank you for your patronage. The numbers, my friends, keep going up and up in the last couple of weeks. Who knows why? Well, I thank you.
Pentagram, dedicated to Henry Foreman. In the years of the primal force and the dawn of terrestrial.
Welcome to Agitators Anonymous podcast. I'm Alan Averill. It is November the 7th. Another year gone by in the blink of an eye, rushing you to meet your end where you can shuffle off this mortal coil. Right then, let's get into it. Agitators Anonymous, episode 270 something or other. Who knows? By the way, I must mention, people have been messaging me as if I control the ads that are placed in the podcast. If you are getting an ad for, let's say, adult diapers, who knows, in your podcast, then maybe this says more about you and your algorithm, and you need to go and get that prostate checked, my friend. The placing of the ad has nothing to do with yours truly. Today's podcast could go either way. There were two things that might have inspired it, and they reached a sort of an impasse. One is a music industry discussion. I'm going to use the band Castle Rat as an example, which sort of proves my thesis a little bit about how the music industry sort of works today. Nothing against that band at all. Just use them as an example. So it's kind of really just an example of the process of the music industry, how it gets from farmyard to table, so to speak. And the other, I had thought about doing something about Cambodia and Vietnam and the left-right axis, and how can we say, I had a big debate, a big argument with a friend of mine, and he said to me, if you think Pol Pot is on the left, I'm going to leave. I'm going to take my drink and leave. This conversation is over. And I thought to myself, you're having a laugh. Really, aren't you? He was a communist revolutionary. Agrarian communism, nonetheless. And in an agrarian society, you can't really seize the methods of distribution, can't really seize the methods of industrialization, but nonetheless, a left-wing revolutionary, a communist revolutionary. And I thought to myself, that might be interesting, about how either side of the debate sort of disowns their own revolutionary figures when the death toll gets too high. But I thought, you know what, Averill, maybe people are a bit tired of all that kind of stuff. And maybe we should just talk about the music industry. Right then, let's do it. The Castle Rat Conundrum. So before we get into the episode, as ever, the podcast is sponsored by Metal Blade Records, the home of Primordial. So you can go to www.metalblade.indiemerch.com, INDIE, metalblade.indiemerch.com, and you can use the code AA2024, and then you type 10% off, and you can get 10% off your order. It is the home of Show No Mercy, Hell Awaits, Cannibal Corpse, Fate's Warning, Merciful Fate, Primordial, tons and tons of bands, Sirith Ongol. The list is endless. Times are tough, and that 10% off can mean an awful lot. And this is the only metal label that is still independent. Right then. Now, back to the episode. There is a live Primordial album, live in New York City, dropping today on Spotify. If you want to go and check it out, there will be links to it, I guess, underneath. It sounds great. Really, really strong. Really, really good. Mixed by Greg from the band Whoa, and filmed originally by Nameless Cult. Came out great, and we just thought, well, this might be a neat and tidy stopover before the discussions of new songs for Primordial turn into perhaps some new songs. And what should we do with them? But I would recommend going over and checking it out. If you want to advertise your band, then get in touch. Slide into my DMs. The podcast keeps growing exponentially. I'm getting more listens now than last month. I had more than I ever did. So there is a relatively captive audience, I use that word sparingly, who may be interested in your rumblings and musings. So get in touch and let's see what we can work out. So a couple of years ago, I noticed this video popped up in my YouTube. And as a fan of, I suppose, swords and sorcery and all, of course, we must make the distinction that so many bands from back in the day, the halcyon days of heavy metal, and whether it is the Gloves of Metal, Manowar, Magnificence, that video, all the way to Manila Road, to Sear Thungo, to whatever. And I know fans of those bands will balk at my comparison with Castle Rat. But there's a long tradition of this kind of Renaissance fair imagery, this Dungeons and Dragons imagery. I noticed a lo-fi video popped up on my YouTube. And I thought to myself, this is interesting. It was a couple of years ago. It didn't have many views. And I sent the link to a couple of friends working in record labels. And I said to them, this band you should keep an eye out for. As I used to do A&R for several labels. Now, they are probably kicking themselves in the shins for not listening to me. But my spidey senses were tingling over this band. Now, why would that be so? I can admit that the whole 3-barrel name bands, Falling in Reverse, Taking Back Monday, whatever these bands are, I never really had any clue about that. When it came to A&R stuff, this wasn't really my forte. But I signed quite a few bands to quite a few labels. And within even that grainy YouTube video for some song by Castle Rat, and that also will become something to discuss, the fact that I can't remember the song. But I recognized something interesting, and here was a band who had some kind of image already worked out. I could see clearly that the girl who was the main protagonist in the video was something of a, I suppose, when I started working for labels, the people above me, the older people working for the labels who'd been there since the 70s and the 80s, would have called that indefinable X factor, that star quality, whatever one might call it. And I was struck by how this diminutive figure might actually have that. The music, a sort of relatively regular, witches of Instagram sort of doom metal. A big helping of Sabbath and all that kind of thing. And then a while later, I watched a YouTube live show from St. Vitus Bar, which I'm not sure if that's still there in New York. I guess it maybe is. We played there once with Primordial. It was great. Really cool place to play. Really cool area. Really enjoyed the experience of playing there. It wasn't the last time we played. Last time was in TVI, which is actually where the live album dropping tomorrow is from. But St. Vitus Bar, yeah. Similar kind of vibe. But it was clear that this band had something. And it was something that the music industry is falling over itself to try and capitalize on. Because, and this is kind of where I'm going to go with this, every record label is looking for, and I think, well, before I say this, there was a quote from, I can't remember exactly his name, but he was the CEO of some huge label. And basically what he was saying is that the days of labels developing artists are gone. The days of artists starting from scratch and working with what once would have been called artist development and all those kinds of things. And also don't forget that back in the days with big labels, those who were working for artist development, when they were working with a band, they were probably being paid money out of the band's advance, because back in those days, the big labels would literally charge everything to the bands. So a band could get, let's say, an advance of $100,000 and think to themselves, wow, cool, $15,000 each to live on, record our album for $25,000, and never really worked out like that. they eventually, all of that 100 grand would be swallowed up with everything from drivers and taxis to hotels to flights to promo to stuff like artist development. Now, once upon a time, bands would sign an artist, and this is also true in the modern heavy metal world. The first thing that a label asks for is like, well, what is the structure from which we can release this record? We, the A&R team, the production team, all this kind of stuff at the label, their job is not anymore to build an artist up. The artist has to be built up. And that's why you get in pop music and in mainstream music terms, very few bands anymore. I've talked about that ad nauseum. I'm not going to start into it again. But it's partly because if musicians are influencers and vice versa, every influencer has to be, you can't really be one without the other, so to speak. You can't have 5 influencers in one band. And so therefore it sort of shears down the amount of musicians who can attract attention from people. So hence why in the modern pop music Western world, so many singular artists. But what labels are looking for is a structure to build upon. And you could see with this band, Castle Rat, who, and this is the part of it that remains, I suppose it remains in the background, is, and I do know of bands who shall remain nameless, who have sat down and thought, well, what's our angle? What's our gimmick? What kind of hoods do we wear? What kind of designs do they have on them? What sort of occult sigils do they have on them? What will be our shtick, as we say in Ireland? What will be our image? Because without an image, in most areas of metal, maybe not in stoner doom or something like this, but you have to have something. Well, now look, you don't have to have anything, but at the same time, if you want that, what we would call it, the shareability factor, which is what record labels will talk about, this is the idea that as soon as you come on stage to play your shows, like in St. Vitus to 150 or 200 people, everyone has their camera out, and they are basically doing the advertising for you. So you may have heard the podcast I did about Creator and Anthrax a couple of months ago, and Creator kicked Anthrax ass. To be honest, Anthrax just had an old school backdrop, and it wasn't really enough. Sad to say. Now, of course, I prefer Creator to Anthrax, but Anthrax had always been a bigger band. But if you were judging it on those merits, there in the arena, and it was 5,000 or 6,000 people that night, you would have assumed Creator was the headliner. There was so much going on the stage. And all these old thrashers who probably hadn't seen Creator in 20, 30 years had their phones out, basically advertising the show to their peers to go to the next show. And it sort of has this drop in the ocean, the ripples move out. And that's basically how things work these days. No band can rely on a label to do that for them. Now, in a perfect world, labels should be paying artists for basically doing their job for them. Well, you're required to be your own promo as a musician, and this is almost entirely without any recompense financially. So what you're doing is basically doing old school. You're essentially doing the old school promo for the people releasing the album. Of course they do. They have their own avenues and their own stuff, but you are required to be your own promo. And very much the small piece of the scene in the industry that you can carve out for yourself now in 2025 relies on you being good at it. A good example may be my own other band, Dread Sovereign. Perhaps we are not that good at it. We just wanted to play music and jam in a room and make lots of noise. And then you find out that like, oh, you have to make reels for this and do this and that and the other. And can you do a bass tutorial? Imagine that, me doing a bass tutorial. And can you make contact of this and that and the other? And we're in the middle of recording a new album, and we realized like, oh, we didn't film any drum recordings, didn't film any stuff. And then you think to yourself, this is not why I started this band Dread Sovereign. I started this band Dread Sovereign to butcher the bass, make a huge big noise, and have a couple of beers in a room, and some fun, making some stuff that sounded like Venom, Tank, Motorhead and Sirathungo. But you're required to do all these other things, and you can see the results. This is the problem. Well, not the problem, but you can see the results. And the results for bands who maybe don't have the songs you have are that they can take steps up the ladder, up the industry, and all of a sudden they're playing at all these festivals. So have this band Castle Rat sat around and gone, well, what's our thing? Let's make it like Renaissance fair, doom metal where we all wear interesting and very well made costumes. But of course it helps that the girl who is the singer is this diminutive, small, ginger, very Irish looking girl who looks like a sort of teen, I don't know, what could you say, like a late teens model from the 1970s. You could imagine her sitting, smoking a cigarette, hanging out with Debbie Harry or something in some scruffy loft in New York in 1977, and I guess that's the aesthetic. And there you go, they're already on the cover of Decibel magazine. They're touring Europe right now as we speak, playing and confirmed for festivals. I saw their name already on Download Festival. And you can see that the ripples, this is how they move out. There was an interview, I think, in The Guardian, maybe, in a proper newspaper about them, because, of course, those newspapers and many media will fall over themselves to tell the story about a girl playing the guitar in a mainly male-dominated sector of the music industry, or any sector of society, really. Now, we can be cynical about that, but let's not forget that that's how things kind of always were, whether it was Lita Ford or Lisa Dominique or whoever else. Wow, there's an old-fashioned reference for you. There was always, from girls' school, Ice Age, I remember off the top of my head, loads of bands from the 80s were sold on something like the same thing. So it's not like it's anything new that anybody tries to sell this band based on the fact that they're being led by this diminutive small girl. It's a perfect story within the music industry. It literally ticks all of the boxes that are made for, well, that's it, empty for ready-made promo. Of course, if they were 4 fat guys from Birmingham, or maybe even just 4 guys from Birmingham, they wouldn't be playing in a venue near you probably right now to a few hundred people. They might be playing in a venue near you to 20 or 30 people, perhaps, or maybe not. Or maybe just playing at noon on one of those Desert Fest festivals. But people are showing up for the spectacle, and they've heard about it, they've seen it. They've heard about this band, they've heard the name, they've seen the image, and the interview mainly seemed to concentrate on how their gigs, very much like Amon Amarth or lots of other pagan metal bands, people show up in furry boots and costumes. And it's something very symptomatic about modern society, that people sort of LARP a bit. The fact that, as I said before about on the podcast, the popularity of bands like Heilung and that kind of thing sometimes is because it's music to game to, but also they look like gaming characters. And this is a very important thing to realize about the success of some of that whole scene that surrounds a band like Heilung. And don't get me wrong, I think a band like Heilung being popular is way better than people listening to songs about, gore grind stuff about killing prostitutes. I think it's far better culturally, and if it moves people to have some greater understanding of their local cultural history, then great. I don't know what percentage that is or how you could even define it, but okay. But objectively, looking at Castle Rat, they also look like computer game characters. And I think this might be something of the appeal, obviously. But the conversation, the interview that I scanned through, I'm not reading an interview with another band. Come on! Who do you think I am? No, the interview that I checked out seemed to be mainly concentrating about the image and about the clothes and all that kind of thing. And throughout my entire scanning, my entire mapping out of this podcast, not once did a song title by this band come into my head. And I thought to myself, that is very telling. That tells its own story. A friend of mine is producing a band who are, without a doubt, on the up, an all-girl band. I shan't say who? And me and him were discussing the ins and outs of producing such a band. And he was saying to me that the girls in the band are getting a bit tired of not being taken seriously musically. Now, this is a band who set out their stall selling the name of the band through an image of overt sexuality. And I thought to myself, this is a problem as old as time, really, isn't it? This has been the problem of the Runaways in 1978. This is the problem, I think, even of male stars maybe in the 80s who set themselves out as heartthrobs or whatever. Are people going to really take the music seriously? I suppose this is the game. Now, of course, this band have hundreds of thousands of Instagram followers. Individually, they have tons of followers, lots and lots of people following them. And I thought to myself as well, the only song I know from this particular band is a cover. I don't know any of their own songs. I've even looked at a video, something has popped up in my reel. Like, that's how well they've got their corner of this whole thing locked down. Pun intended. And that is kind of the problem. Because when you want to be taken seriously, having built your career on a certain platform, how does that actually work to be kind of, hey guys, by the way, I mean, Butcher Babies, this terrible band that was basically formed by two girls, in a state of undress, shall we say, jumping around the stage. Butcher Babies, by the way, is a classic Plasmatics song by the original, the OG Wendy O. Williams, the very much missed and departed Wendy O. Williams. Go and listen to Coup de Grace and stop listening to me talking, or go and listen to the Plasmatics and stop listening to me talking, would probably be a better idea. It would be a better idea for anything you can particularly think of. But to now turn around and go, well, you know what? Butcher Babies are still playing. Obviously, they're still making some kind of a career. But I guarantee they don't appear in a state of undress anymore. I'm pretty sure they appear in a state of, well, they are dressed now. And probably their moment has slightly come and gone. Because who really is taking Butcher Babies seriously musically? Certainly not I. And certainly not people who take music seriously. Now, Ghost, for example, is a band who walk the line and walk it quite well. Like when I hear Rats, for example, this song, I hear classic Dokken. And Dokken was the blueprint for a lot of, if you listen to maybe songs from Unchain the Night, you can hear lots of Ghost in there. And on Dokken were always the band that Poison weren't, or the proper musical band of that whole. I'm not going to call them glam metal. They had big hair, but they weren't necessarily glam metal. It's just hard rock, I guess. Heavy metal for lightning strikes again. But Ghost walked the line between novelty and actually having great songwriting. There are songs on Meliora that I think to myself, yeah, this is really good songwriting. You can't really deny it. So it is possible to marry those things together, but you've got to really be as good a songwriter as Tobias is, and that is quite a difficult thing to process. Now, the truth is, when you think of Ghost, because don't forget Ghost already started in 2005, but when you think of Ghost, you can think of songs. You don't just think of the image of Papa Emeritus. But they started at the perfect moment with their first album, which was still in a time when people were buying physical copy. So Castle Rat, for example, don't have that to fall back on. So subsequently, here I am, a middle-aged man, discussing the way the music industry works in 2025, but I'm discussing a band who seem to be succeeding in taking on the music industry on those terms, but I can't tell you a song. I can't actually tell you a riff. And that's not just because I don't pay attention, which would be a reasonable accusation leveled against me, that I don't pay much attention to anything, really. I mean, there's no denying she can play, the band can play. Absolutely no denying that. It's quite different to the situation with this awful band Dogma, which I don't know if any of you have been following. This is reply to me in the comments, but they couldn't play at all. I mean, it was just clearly, this was an idea. This actually is exactly what I mean, is that someone sat down somewhere in a backstage or in something like this and thought, well, let's just put 4 hot girls in a relative state of undress, dressed as nuns, it's vaguely blasphemous, and get them out there on tour. And then contacted various people they thought who might be interested in it. But again, you know, the Monkees didn't write their own songs, did they? And then they kind of wanted control over the songwriting. They did make the rather odd and interesting movie. I think it's called Head, is it not? Anyway, I digress, as is my wont. But Dogma, yeah, this was clearly a name and an image owned by management, and they didn't want people beginning to rock the boat. They were like, hey, here's the fee, here's what you get per show, this is it. We own the image, we own this, we own the other. And, of course, they're playing festivals that, as I said, 4 guys from Birmingham aren't being invited to play. And you get the reason why I say that, because there could be 4 guys from Birmingham playing 25% as good as Black Sabbath who won't be invited to fuck all because they're just 4 fat, ugly dudes from Birmingham. And so their place is taken by nonsense like Dogma. And when you watch the footage, it's quite shocking how awful the musicianship is. So that's completely the other side of this, in the sense that there's an example of something that is so crassly manipulative. But yet, there it is at a festival. I'm sure people are watching it going, oh, okay, look, there's 4 hot girls dressed as nuns with corpse paint on. How come someone never ever thought about this before? And then someone did. And, well, the recent kind of amusing fallout from it all passed, for most people, I imagine, 10 minutes while they sat on the toilet flicking through their reels. But that could have also been a bombing in a foreign country as well that passed the same time. And that was probably, in truth, the following reel that you saw. Anyway, does it point to what I often argue about, the broader emasculation of the metal scene? That there is this plethora of all-girl bands that just seem to be making more and more inroads and climbing higher in the metal scene. I think it's really just a product of the fact that this is an Instagram-ready music industry, and that if you want to get, eyes on your band, that's what you need rather than sounds. You need an image, you need a gimmick, you need a shtick. It's not only them. There are plenty of other bands who clearly have sat down and gone, right, what kind of capes do we wear? And not all heroes wear capes, by the way. And don't mistake lack of talent for genius, as the mighty Typo Negative once said. I do wonder, would Typo, and I did a podcast about this maybe 100 podcasts ago, which was, would a band like, loosely based around doom death and doom metal and slow, gloomy music, of which there was tons in the mid-90s, and I thought to myself, would a band like Typo Negative get big now, sounding the way they were? Now nothing, of course, now sounds like them. Of course, if you were listening to the podcast last week, you will have noticed that my views about Coroner seem to have been echoed by an awful lot of the music industry or the metal scene. The new Coroner album is mature and has a dark songwriting aesthetic to it. It has dynamics. It has maturity, of which is almost entirely missing from most of the metal scene. And if you think back to the 90s and bands like Typo Negative, and even bands like Nine Inch Nails and stuff, would this stuff be big now? I'm not sure it would be. Because everything now seems to be a bit frivolous and a bit daft. Because Castle Rat is high camp, and it's sort of frivolous, and it's a bit daft. It's not to say it's bad. You shouldn't judge them in terms of propping them up against a monolith like Typo Negative, because they're just continuing down the path of many bands in the 70s and the 80s, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with them. I'm not having a go, just using them as an example to illustrate how the machine of the music industry kind of works these days. And, chill out, Avro. Who cares? Yeah, it's true. They're just a band. And they're not the worst band at all. And people seem to enjoy seeing them, and that's no big deal. But they have played the game, and this is the game that I've been discussing on the podcast before, illustrating how the music industry works, and that you've got to you've got to build the infrastructure, you've got to build all of these things before a label goes, okay, let's put the record out. You've got enough. I mean, this, as I said before, the singer seems to have 40,000 of her own Instagram followers, through which she can probably sell other things. The band themselves had 70,000 Instagram followers and 137,000 monthly listeners on Spotify. Dagger Dragger. Okay, yes, I do know that song title. Wolf, Wizard, Phoenix, Siren. Yeah. I mean, I'd rather listen to Black Magic SS, but there you go. But let it be known, this podcast is not a criticism of Castle Rat. It's just merely using them as an example of how the music industry works right now, and how, if you play the game, you can move the pieces on the board pretty quick. Not everybody is as lucky to have all of the components perfectly fitting together. Like I said, that band would not work if it wasn't for the image of the singer. And so, there you go, my friends. Agitators Anonymous is just a little look, an exemplar of how a band is using all of the things to their advantage. And yeah, now that I think of it, Dagger Dragger is a pretty cool song. So, I got a glass of wine poured here, and I'm going to stick on Dagger Dragger by Castle Rat. And I shall see you all next week.